Welcome to Film Prov, where everything is made up and my opinions don't matter. We have now made it to the third part of my Sam Raimi Spider-Man retrospective, where we look at, what else? The third part of Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy, 2007's Spider-Man 3. Depending on who you ask, this movie is either the worst of the three, the worst Spider-Man movie of them all, or a criminally underrated gem. So in light of the theatrical re-releases of these movies earlier this year, I'm taking it upon myself to go back to these films and assess for myself exactly how good were they really. Be sure to check out the first two videos in this series, discussing Spider-Man 1 and 2 respectively, but to summarize, Spider-Man 1 is massively overrated and has aged poorly.
He stinks and I don't like him.
But Spider-Man 2 is still a genuinely solid and enjoyable film, if just a little bit overhyped.
That's pretty good.
Now, Spider-Man 3 will be a different beast because it has a pretty bad reputation. It received poor reviews upon release that soured many people on these movies as a whole, and when combined with Raimi's own frustrations in making this film, contributed to this series being canned in favor of a reboot 5 years later. Now, while I've generally considered this to be a pretty bad movie, it's still one I'm nostalgic for. Like the second film, I saw it in theaters, owned it on DVD, and as a kid watched it many times. So I'm hoping my childhood nostalgia and modern disdain will cancel each other out and I'll be able to look at this movie as objectively as possible and give it an honest critique. One thing I have maintained in doing all of these videos is that I am not going to comment on how campy or silly these movies are or how many great memes have come from them. The cheesiness is an intentional stylistic choice from Raimi to replicate the tone of a comic book from the 60s, and whether you like that or not says more about your own personal tastes than the films themselves. I will also try to avoid echoing what other better reviewers and essayists have said before, both because I can't make their points better than them, and also because I just don't have much interest in talking about something unless I feel I have something new to add to the conversation. But without further ado, let's comb our bangs in front of our face and emotionally neglect our girlfriends, because it's time to dive right into Spider-Man 3. Before the movie even starts, I noticed something on this rewatch, and that is that the Spider-Man theme has such kind of a great lead-in. Like, the way they play it over the opening studio logos really kind of gets you hyped by the time you reach the third movie. Just that slight little strings playing the theme real soft. And then they start to pick up the tempo, you hear the drums kind of kicking in. It really is such a great theme. As the movie starts, we see Peter talking about how great things are, and then we get to the first real proper scene, being him going to see Mary Jane perform her musical. Which, first off, I am fascinated as to what this musical is, because it's a Broadway musical. And looking at the opening number, it's just a song about love. It doesn't really set up what this show is about. The set is just stairs, which, no. In Broadway musicals, typically the opening number establishes either a location, a plot, or something. It establishes something about the musical and the story, and the set is a set. This has to be the set for the rest of the show. This set that we see here would be a minimalist set even for an award show. So not surprised this musical is going to get bad reviews. But that's beside the point. In this, we learn two things. One, that Peter and MJ have been together long enough, meaning this is long enough after Spider-Man 2, that Peter is now planning a proposal to MJ. Now, we can be generous and say that it's, been maybe a few months. Peter's obviously someone who's loved Mary Jane for a very long time, so he's probably already made up his mind that he wants to marry her. But in this time, we learn that he's never talked to Harry about what happened with his dad. Harry is still holding this grudge. He's still planning to kill Peter. So did Peter just forget about the fact that his best friend now knows that he's Spider-Man, thinks he killed his father, and probably is going to want to kill him too, considering that he spent all of Spider-Man 2 saying that he wants to kill Spider-Man? In fact, he literally tried to kill Spider-Man.
Kill Spider-Man. We'll give you all the tritium you need.
Which, speaking of the Goblin stuff, I like how they show all the Goblin gear from the first movie. Aside from the suit, some pretty cool stuff. The cool glider, the mask, and then they immediately pan to the new Goblin stuff, and it just kind of rubs in that all the new Goblin stuff is so much lamer than the old gear. After we see Harry smelling some essential oils, we jump right into the other movie villains. We see the meteor land with the alien symbiote, and I gotta say, I love the stringy, sinewy design for the symbiote and the way it moves. I like it so much better than just it being black goo. But aside from that, you can really feel the disjointedness of this movie's three antagonists in their introduction scenes. They are one right after the other. Now, they're right at the beginning, which is pretty typical for a Sam Raimi movie. He likes to get the plot going right away. But they're non sequiturs. They have nothing to do with each other. One is a continuation from a previous movie, but aesthetically is a bit of a step down. One is a completely random event with no setup or reason, just Peter is in a park and a meteor hits, which, I guess we're introducing aliens now. Cool. And then the third is just a very weirdly sad and dramatic scene with characters that we've never met before. Now, I will say at least the Sandman scene is genuinely emotionally effective, but it's just strange. Since in the comics he's usually portrayed as just a simple thug, he very easily could have been sort of a henchman to a larger villain, but the fact that these scenes just are so disconnected from one another really kind of foreshadows how this movie is going to play out later. After our trio of villain introductions, we then go see Aunt May, and I gotta say this movie has the least amount of Aunt May, but what little Aunt May it has is probably my least favorite moments for us in the whole trilogy. Your scenes are bad when even how it should have ended is gonna make fun of how boring they are.
I'm gonna ask MJ to marry me. Oh, that reminds me of a long, boring story.
But after Peter understandably leaves, he gets attacked by the new goblin, and man, the new goblin sucks. His design is so lame. I clown on the Green Goblin design from the first movie, but at least it's something. It's something interesting. It's something new. Harry's goblin suit, which literally the only reason he's called Goblin is just for the legacy of it, it's just a plain black suit with roller skating pads and a paintball mask. It could have been so cool to see an upgraded Green Goblin suit terrorizing Peter like some kind of blast from the past. The minute he sees it, it instantly triggers some kind of terrorized PTSD or something from him. But instead it's just so lackluster. Really, the new Goblin in general is just kind of a waste of a villain. We only get one proper action scene with him. But I will say, that action set piece is genuinely really good. I, again, referenced it with the first movie, but this is what I wish the fight scenes were like in that first movie. High speed, high flying, high octane action. This is a super agile hero who swings above the city, fighting a villain with a jet glider and an arsenal of bombs and missiles. Have some fun with it, and these guys really, really do. Even if the way the fight ends is kind of silly. The way Peter clotheslines and then knocks out Harry Osborn, the dude acts like a ball in Plinko. But then, this leads directly to probably the biggest problem with the movie. People always talk about how Spider-Man 3's biggest problem is that there's 3 villains, and I say yes, but actually no. The problem is not the number of villains, it's how they're implemented and integrated into the story. If you want multiple villains, you can combine them in one streamlined narrative. Otherwise, you could have them as cameos. Think Rhino in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. You can make a couple villains as henchmen in a hierarchy of villains led by one leader. Either way, just combine them into one story. New Goblin, Venom, and Sandman are basically in 3 different movies here, which are only connected by Peter kind of popping in and out of them. Well, really, they're the ones doing the popping in and out because the way this movie is paced and structured is baffling. The villains will just show up and be the main antagonist for 20 minutes, then they'll get kicked out of the story and forgotten about for a while we move on to the next villain. Unless you've seen this movie a bunch of times or you're actively trying to think about it, it is so easy to genuinely forget that any of these villains are in this movie until they suddenly show up again after 30 minutes and you go, oh yeah, he's here too. It makes for such a disjointed and honestly disorienting viewing experience. And after doing this video, it's now shocking to me that 2 out of these 3 acclaimed movies have such strange plotting. But now that New Goblin has been kicked out of the movie, time to move on to Sandman. And everyone said it before, so I'll just acknowledge that I agree. The Sandman scene is fantastic. Special effects look great, the lack of dialogue is great, the emotions are great. Overall, great scene. Moving on. While that's going on, Peter and MJ are having relationship troubles. She is stressed because her Broadway show isn't doing very good, probably because there wasn't a set or a plot, and Peter is just overall being unhelpful.
This is something you're gonna have to get used to. Believe me, I know. Spider-Man gets attacked all the time.
This isn't about you.
And man, if you thought that Peter and MJ's scenes were bad in the first two movies, they are miserable here because they're both being terrible to each other. Although Peter, I'd say, is arguably being worse, he just acts so stupid. He's completely unaware of what MJ is going through, and he completely misses any of the nonverbal cues she's giving him. Probably the worst scene is Peter's failed proposal at the restaurant, in which this dude actually mansplains MJ's own feelings to her.
No, I know exactly how you feel. Listen, I have been through this. It happens to me all the time. I see Spider-Man posters in the window, kids running around with me on their sweaters. It's a big Halloween item.
And the thing is that it's never really addressed. Peter's personal arc in this movie is about him not giving in to rage and anger and vengeance, not learning how to be a better boyfriend. There's like one line from Aunt May about how a husband has to put his wife first, and then he does because he realizes he's being an asshole and shouldn't ask Mary J to marry him, but that's literally like two little moments in a 2.5-hour movie. Their romantic subplot is literally just Peter fumbling around in his relationship until MJ breaks up with him. But when she breaks up with him, it has nothing to do with the fact that he's been a terrible boyfriend. She breaks up with him for a completely different reason, an artificial reason. She breaks up with him because Harry tells her to. Even once Peter realizes that he needs to put her before him or whatever, it's not that he learns how to be a better boyfriend, he just learns that he shouldn't propose to her. I don't think this man actually ever learns what he was doing wrong, or if he was doing anything wrong. It's maddening that after 2 movies of them being terrible by not being together, they are somehow even worse now that they are together. That being said, on the topic of Peter's character arcs, while the other 2 movies are so fast-paced starting out, setting everything up and starting Peter's arc, this movie takes forever. That's largely because of how, again, cluttered and disjointed the movie is. Peter's primary arc is definitely dealing with his rage and anger, but the movie can't really get into that until over an hour in, because it has to set up all the other moving pieces first. Peter doesn't even feel a twinge of anger until almost exactly the 1 hour mark. In fact, in the first hour of the movie, the only thing Peter really does is have a couple bad guy fights, and then unknowingly self-sabotage his relationship. Once the black suit arc gets started, he seemingly kills Sandman, then he takes the suit off and the plot goes back to meandering again. Like I said before, Sandman just gets kicked out of the movie for a bit.
Good riddance.
And then Harry remembers that he's supposed to be a villain now, until Peter blows him up and kicks him out of the story again. And on the topic of Sandman and Peter's rage, I hate how they retcon Uncle Ben's death. I hate that they change it to where it was an accident, and I hate that they changed the killer to Sandman instead of the other robber. It retroactively ruins what is probably the most important part of Spider-Man's origin story aside from the spider bite. Ben wasn't killed because Peter failed to stop the killer, meaning the responsibility that Peter learns kind of becomes moot. Plus, I think Ben's death should be the result of a random act of criminal violence, instead of tying it to a supervillain. I have the same problem with the '89 Batman movie and Bruce Wayne's parents. If it's a known villain, then the hero just develops a personal vendetta instead of wanting to fight crime in general. They're not a victim of the rampant crime in the city, they're the victim of just one super evil guy. It's one of the things I actually prefer about The Amazing Spider-Man. Clunky as the scene is, it's truly a random act of violence, and Peter actually never gets his revenge on the guy, instead choosing to give up on vengeance and fight for justice. Taking a brief break from criticizing this movie and making fun of something instead, I don't mind that Peter has the evil My Chemical Romance bangs, but the fact that we see him stop and make a point to look in the mirror and comb it forward makes it so much sillier. Like I've said with all 3 of these movies, I don't have an issue with how corny these movies are because that's intentional. However, this is played like it's supposed to be serious. Peter just killed a guy, and this is Peter's dark side coming through, and it's just so dumb that we can't possibly take it seriously. Then, there's the infamous Saturday Night Fever strut down the street, Bully Maguire in his prime. I've seen a lot of arguments for and against it. People say it's trying to be cool, but it's dorky and cringy. People say it's intentionally nerdy, because this is a geek trying to be what he thinks is cool. People are mad because it takes a story arc that's traditionally played very straight and given a dark tone, and makes it lighthearted and goofy. I honestly don't know what the movie wants us to think, whether it wants us to think it's cool or not, because look at the reaction Peter gets from the women on the street. It's an almost this 50-50 mix of women either finding it attractive and cool, and women finding it ridiculous and silly. And while I think it tonally fits with the rest of the series, being very lighthearted and cheesy, I do think it's weird given the context. Peter has now seemingly killed 2 people in cold blood, ruined the career of his rival, and is going through his life just now being very aggressive and rude and dark to everyone. Obviously he's going to be enjoying it, but the music is telling us that we are supposed to as well. And this is partially because I think that the black suit arc is a very hard arc to do in this style. Remember, Sam Raimi's love for Spider-Man came from the Silver Age comics, the 60s and early 70s, when comic books are very lighthearted, campy, cheesy. This is that classic, I'll get you next time, Spider-Man!
We'll meet again, Spider-Man!
Whereas the black suit arc comes from like the mid to late 80s, when things were a lot more dark and serious. Especially given the way the story is told in later years, with elements added like the suit making him more aggressive and violent. It really is more like a drug addiction story, and so it really doesn't jive very well tonally with a more lighthearted, campy story like Sam Raimi is used to telling. It's really kind of indicative of the fact that Sam Raimi wasn't really keen on adding Venom and doing the black suit arc because he just was never really into the character and it didn't really fit with his world, but he was kind of forced to by Avi Arad in the studio. Now, while I have conflicting thoughts on the street dance, the nightclub dance number is just all bad. Like, no conflict, all bad. I am dead certain on that. Everyone knows it's bad. I'm saying nothing new here, but it's just a cringe-worthy sequence nestled into one of the most uncomfortable parts of the whole movie. I think this is the moment Raimi probably bit off a little more than he could chew with the over-the-topness. I don't think even his energetic, stylized filmmaking could save this part. And it's really funny because immediately after, we go straight into the church scene, which is genuinely fantastic. My sincere enjoyment of it is only briefly interrupted by the ironic enjoyment of watching Topher Grace get down on his knees and pray for Jesus to kill someone.
I want you to kill Peter Parker.
Hey! Stop fucking with Korean Jesus. He ain't got time for your problems. He busy with Korean shit.
Speaking of Topher Grace and Venom overall, I haven't really talked much about him. People have kind of gone back and forth as to whether this version of Venom is good. I mean, we can all agree that there isn't a lot of screen time for him, and it would be nice for there to be more. I remember people were very angry with Topher Grace's casting, saying that he's too small, he is too scrawny and too nerdy to be the traditional Eddie Brock that we know of. Eddie Brock is a bit of a meathead. He's kind of a big jock. And while I do give credit, like if you actually look at Venom in this movie, like you see that Topher Grace put on a lot of muscle, and he actually is a very muscular guy. He's just not like cartoonishly big. But I can definitely see what Raimi was going with in casting Topher Grace, and I do like that since Venom is kind of supposed to be the evil version of Spider-Man, that they made Eddie sort of a darker version of Peter. He's still kind of geeky, still kind of nerdy, but just instead of being someone who learned about responsibility, he's just a jerk. I just wish that, they spent more time establishing him instead of having to wrestle for screen time with 2 other villains. This is kind of beside the point, but it just kind of makes me think. Once MJ gets kidnapped, for the 3rd time, by the way, by the villains, Peter goes to Harry to ask for help. And we see Harry, who's scarred by the explosion that Peter caused by, throwing a grenade to his face. But think about it. His face is scarred, not wounded. It just makes me think, how long is the 3rd act of this movie? Like, how much time does it take place over? Because Peter gives Harry 3rd-degree burns on his face. But the next time we see him, they're just scars. His face is more or less healed over. Like, shouldn't he be all Two-Face right now? But that's beside the point. Peter goes to fight Venom and Sandman. Harry eventually joins in. They kill Venom and make peace with Sandman while Harry dies. Then Peter decides not to marry Jane, but to just go see her and I guess get back together, and the movie ends. Now, while I've taken kind of a contrarian stance with the first 2 movies, I do have to side with the majority and say that, yeah, Spider-Man 3 is the worst. And it's not just the worst of the trilogy as in the least good. I mean, I genuinely think this is kind of a bad movie. It's not the worst superhero movie ever made, but it definitely has some very critical flaws that make it so I cannot genuinely say it's a good movie. It has some great parts in it. Some great casting choices, great effects, great action, great moments, but those moments are just weaved together in such a confusing way that it makes for just a very strange viewing experience. I do genuinely feel really bad for Sam Raimi. I think some of the problems with this movie came from the fact that he wasn't given complete control. He wasn't able to make the movie that he wanted to, and he seems to deeply regret a lot of things that went down with this movie, and I feel bad for him. He seems like a cool guy, and it's nice to know that he's still out there making good movies. But over the years, as more Spider-Man movies have come out, people have tried to revise this movie's legacy. Once the Amazing Spider-Man movies came out, people didn't like them and said the Raimi movies were better, and they included Spider-Man 3 with that. Amazing Spider-Man 2 came out, and that became the worst Spider-Man movie. Then when the Tom Holland movies came out with the MCU, suddenly Spider-Man Twitter decided that those movies are just all terrible, and all the Raimi movies are great and the gold standard. And these are the movies that perfectly encapsulate Spider-Man as a character. And just look, I understand nostalgia. I understand looking back at the way things used to be and missing that time. Because the fact is that most of the movies we grew up with weren't better. Some of them were, but also good movies have been made since the dawn of cinema. The fact is that they come from a time that was seemingly simpler to us. We were younger. The world didn't seem as complicated then. Our movies were just our movies. Back then, superhero movies were just a genre. Now this genre was starting to dominate the box office. The Spider-Man movies were some of the highest grossing films of all time at that point, but that's so different from how it is now, where superhero movies are just absolutely dominating the landscape, and we're getting almost 10 different comic book movies a year, and they're all starting to just kind of bleed together into forgettable, monotonous slop. So I get that urge to look back at these movies and think things were better back then. And like I said before, there are a lot of good things to like about these movies. Art, by nature, is subjective. A movie that I say isn't the best, someone might consider it their favorite. I legitimately want to know what you guys think of these movies. This isn't just me engagement farming. If you like these movies, if you don't like these movies, if you agree with me, if you disagree with me, if there's some points that you think I missed or didn't consider, I legitimately want to know. I just would discourage anyone from making these grand sweeping statements, because ultimately, art is not objective. These movies are not objectively better than any other superhero movies. They're not objectively worse. There are elements that I think are effective, that are not effective, that are better, that are worse. Like I said, everything here is made up, and my opinions don't matter. I have genuinely enjoyed going back and watching these movies. Like I said before, I haven't watched these in years, and it's really kind of interesting the kinds of opinions that you can form just by thinking about movies without really watching them. You know, I went into this with certain expectations about what I was going to like and dislike about these movies, and some things genuinely surprised me. So, you know, really what you should do is watch the movies for yourselves, make up your own mind, make your own YouTube video, or if you don't want to do that, let me know what you think down in the comments. And this is the part where I actually will pander for engagement. While you're here, also give me a like, give me a subscribe, hit that little bell icon if you want to get notified every time I upload, which should be every 6 months at this rate. Thank y'all for watching, you guys have a great rest of your day, and of course, don't feed the plants.